100, Chapter 43, Reproductive Systems. So we are going to be talking about reproductive systems. Reproductive systems are obviously important because that is how you continue to thrive as a species, right? Without reproduction, a species would die off and there would be no more. So this is something that's obviously really important in terms of evolution and surviving. And your book kind of goes into quite a few different. So we're going to talk about how animals reproduce. We are not going to talk about asexual reproduction because it does not relate to human reproduction. And we will be talking about sexual reproduction, which is what humans do. But we will not be touching on other forms of sexual reproduction in plants and animals as well. We'll not really be going too far into life history strategies, but just know that all of this is in your book. So if you are interested, you can always read through that. We will be going over the human male and female reproductive systems, as well as control of human reproduction and sexually transmitted diseases as well. Okay, so sexual reproduction is when the egg of one parent is fertilized by the sperm of another. Fertilization can be external, like in fish or amphibians, which we won't get into, or in our case, internal, right? Animals, or humans even, produce these things called gametes and specialized organs called gonads. So we know testes produce sperm, ovaries produce eggs. And gametes are essentially just your sex cells. So we haven't gotten too far into how our cells reproduce and differentiate, which is what we'll be getting into soon. But we can either go through a process called mitosis or meiosis. Mitosis is our cells basically just copying each other and making more and more, and that's how we develop from a fertilized egg into a baby, right? And how we continue to replace cells as we get older. But meiosis it's called haploid, which means half. So basically there's one chromosome instead of two, right? Which is what our gametes are. So mom is an XX, dad is an XY, and we'll be talking about this more in the next couple weeks as well. But mom can give an X, dad can give an X or a Y, right? And each one of those is in a gamete, and then that's going to combine with the other sex, so sperm with an egg, fertilize, and then create a zygote, right? So copulation is the actual sexual union to facilitate reception of sperm. Most animals are dioecious, which is separate sexes, so just like humans, right? Egg of one parent is fertilized by sperm of another. There is also hermaphrodites in animals that contain both male and female sex organs, and again, we won't really go into that, but if you're interested, the book has it. Okay, with vertebrates, and especially humans, we are viviparous. So that means that we're live born. We have care of a zygote and an embryo within us, and we do have a placenta, which is common in mammals, and that eliminates the need for a shelled egg. Because you do have other vertebrates like reptiles and birds that are oviparous, and they do have eggs with yolk, and that's what's feeding the baby essentially. Okay, getting into the male reproductive system. So we have all of the organs and functions up here, but going into the male gonads, we have paired testes that are suspended in the scrotum, and this is different. We'll get into female anatomy here in a second, but it's different than female anatomy where we have ovaries that are within the body, right? And here we have the testes in the scrotum that are actually hanging outside of the body. And the reason for that is because sperm cannot go through spermatogenesis or keep creating more sperm with the internal body temperature. So they've actually got to kind of hang outside of the body so that they're at a more happy temperature so that they can go through this whole process. But the testes here, they're producing sperm and sex hormones like testosterone. The epididymides or epididymis is where the sperm will then go to mature, and we will also store some sperm there. So sperm is being produced in the testes. It goes through this whole process of spermatogenesis, and we won't get into all of the details associated with that, but basically it's creating sperm over time, which takes, I think it's about 5 weeks total. And then it takes a little bit longer even to mature in the epididymis. I think the total cycle for spermatogenesis is somewhere around 70, 75 days. So it does take a little bit of time, although we'll see once we get to the females that that is relatively little time and energy to go through spermatogenesis in comparison to producing an ovum, right? But once the testes produce the sperm, again, it'll go into epididymis, which is where it'll mature and even store some of the sperm, and then it'll go through the vasa deferentia or vas deferens and seminal vesicles, as well as the prostate gland. All three of these are, well, the vas deferens is conducting and storing sperm, so we're just taking, it's basically another storage site when the epididymis gets full. The seminal vesicles and the prostate gland are both contributing fluid to semen for it to, once it's ejaculate, this is the fluid that's being added to it so that it can actually do several things instead of just be sperm, right? And it's pretty crazy actually what happens. Like the prostate contributes fluid that actually helps the sperm go into the vaginal canal, and like it produces uterine contractions and actually helps kind of get it into where it needs to be in the female. It's pretty crazy how much actually goes into this, and how complex sexual reproduction really is. But after it gets the fluid, to make it into semen, then it's going to go out the urethra, which is what will actually conduct the sperm and urine to. And then we also have these bulbal urethral glands that are also contributing fluid to semen. And then the penis is obviously the organ of copulation. So this is what is being used to complete sexual reproduction. So you can see here, again, we have the testes. This is where sperm is being produced. It's going through these seminiferous tubercles and then going into the epididymis to mature and storing some within the epididymis as well as the vas deferens, and then working its way up, going through here into the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and then going to go out the urethra as ejaculate. So in the testes, these seminiferous tubules, that is where meiosis actually occurs. So meiosis is the process of making sex cells. So this is essentially, we're just making more sperm cells, right? Mature sperm have 3 distinct pieces. They have a head, acrosome, a midpiece, and a tail, right? So you can see here spermatogenesis. We start with a spermatogonium. Mitosis means that we're just doubling our spermatogonium. We're making 2 of these. But now we're getting into meiosis. Meiosis does have 2 stages to it, always. And this is how we're making our sex cells. So we're going from diploid, or 2 in, to 1 in. I'm not too worried about you getting too caught up in that. You will hear more about it coming up soon. But just know that basically instead of having the 2 chromosomes, now we just have the 1 chromosome. So when you have sex with someone and you create a baby, right, you're giving up one of your chromosomes to go to that baby, one of your sex chromosomes, and you're going to give it either an X or a Y if you're a male, or if you're female, you're going to give it an X, one of your X's basically. And so that's coming from meiosis, from sex cells. And then once it goes through meiosis, you create these things called spermatids, and then they go through a differentiation process to actually create sperm. Okay, so getting into the female reproductive system, and you'll see here as we start talking about the female reproductive system, females, it takes so much more energy to be able to go through the female reproductive system, right? This is why, if you've ever heard that females get to be choosy, right? And this is true in human society, but definitely in animal society as well, is that the female is normally the one making the choice of which male she wants to be with. And it's because females put a lot of energy into reproducing, not even just actually, creating and caring for the baby in the womb and then afterwards as well. But even just to create these eggs, right? That takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. Sperm are relatively cheap and easy, right? Which is, if you ever hear that term, cheap and easy meaning it takes 74 days to make a ton of sperm, right? And that's relatively low compared to the female reproductive system. So males can produce, I think it's like, I don't remember it. It's like a crazy, like over 70 million sperm a day can be produced. So again, sperm are cheap and easy. Females are not. So females get to be the ones that choose their mates because they put so much more energy into it. This is true, obviously, in all animal systems, including the humans. But going into the female reproductive organs, females do have ovaries, which are producing eggs, and sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and a little bit of testosterone, but not nearly as much. Oviducts are fallopian tubes. Those are what conduct the egg and actually are the location of fertilization. The uterus or the womb is what is housing developing embryos and fetus. And then the vagina is what receives the penis during copulation and serves as the birth canal as well. So you can see here, again, going from the ovary where the egg is being produced. And then you can see the other parts here as well, the uterus, cervix, vagina, urethra, clitoris, labia minora, majora, um, all the different parts here essentially, and we'll be going into them in a little bit more detail here in just a second. Um, so with ovaries release ova and produce estrogen and progesterone like we talked about. And we'll go into the ovarian cycle here, but just to talk about how eggs are produced in females. So when females are born, they're actually born with all the eggs they're ever going to have in their life, right? So they're born with, usually I think it's close to about 1 million eggs, but the eggs do not mature at birth, right? They don't start maturing until they can go through oogenesis, which is when it starts at puberty, when girls get their periods and begin their menstrual cycles. So that's why females, as you age, your eggs are getting older and they're not as viable. It's hard to have children the older you get, and that's because your eggs have been around since birth. This is different than some other animals where all eggs mature at the same time. Our eggs, or mature at different times, but our eggs are maturing technically at different times, but they've been around for the same amount of time. So it is kind of interesting. Our oocytes basically stop maturing until puberty when we can go through oogenesis. So human eggs mature one by one. Every month you're maturing one egg where it's either getting fertilized or it's dying off. What we're talking about right now, though, is the ovarian cycle. So this cycle actually takes, I think, about 375 days, and it is what largely drives the menstrual cycle, which is different, right? So with the ovarian cycle, what's happening is we're maturing the follicle and the egg. The menstrual cycle, which we'll talk about, is what's happening in the uterus to prepare for a fertilized egg. So this ovarian cycle has to happen first, and it starts happening really since birth. We're starting to go through this and mature follicles and eggs, and then at puberty is when we get that hormonal cascade. Our hypothalamus is sending hormones through our pituitary gland and then out to the rest of our body, into our ovaries and things like that, to start going through this cycle. And this cycle has 3 different phases: the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. So starting with the follicular phase, we are producing this FSH, this follicular stimulating hormone, which promotes development of a follicle, but it only promotes development of one follicle, whatever one is furthest along. And then that follicle is going to secrete estrogen, which then causes it to grow even more and then signals the pituitary gland to release even more FSH. So once it once the estrogen comes and the follicle is growing, and it promotes the pituitary gland, it actually promotes the pituitary gland, sorry, to release this luteinizing hormone, LH, to kind of finish off the job. So once this LH is released, it goes into ovulation essentially. So it's working on the oocyte within that follicle, and it's just been sitting there not doing anything, and it's going to trigger it to complete meiosis 1, which means that it's going to start dividing. So now the follicle that's mature is going to push up against the ovary wall. This takes about 14 days for this phase to go through. It's going to push up against the ovary wall and rupture, releasing that secondary oocyte from a vesicular follicle. So at this point now you've ovulated, right? You've released that secondary oocyte, and the follicle is going to develop in something called the corpus luteum. And if it is not fertilized and there's no pregnancy, then it's going to degenerate over time. But before it degenerates, this corpus luteum is going to promote the pituitary to again release some of those hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and basically tell it to stop going through this part of the phase. The corpus luteum also, producing these hormones also creates or prepares the uterus to receive the oocyte in the case of if you were actually pregnant, right? And it's going to travel down the fallopian tube, which is about 10 centimeters long, where it might meet a sperm. And then from the fallopian tube into the uterus, where if it is fertilized after about a week, right, it's going to start developing. If not, it's going to slough off, which is the first phase of the uterine or menstrual cycle, which is what happens about every 28 days or so when the endometrium, which is kind of that inner layer of the uterus, that's where where gestation is going to take place. So once the egg is fertilized and you're going to start growing the baby, right, it's happening in that endometrium layer, which if you're not pregnant, then that's going to slough off and you're going to go into your menstrual cycle. The luteal phase is that luteinizing hormone is going to promote development of the corpus luteum, so what we saw up here, and then secrete progesterone. Ovarian cycle, oogenesis, and ovulation. So I know that this is obviously more complicated than when we were talking about the sperm, but before birth, right, our oogonium are going to be reproducing through meiosis and making these things called primary oocytes. And we have all of those at birth. Those are basically all of our eggs, but then until we go through puberty, we're not going to start going through the rest of meiosis until that point. And then we're going to create these secondary oocytes. We're going to go through ovulation, and if we have sperm entry and it successfully fertilizes, then we're going to make a fertilized egg and go through the gestation and create the zygote, which will turn into an embryo, which will turn into a fetus. Right? If not, then we keep going through this cycle every 28 days or so in our menstrual cycle and going through the ovarian cycle as well. Okay, so switching back to hormonal regulation, we'll talk about hormonal regulation in males. Again, it's the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary that are really regulating hormone cascades in both males and females. The hypothalamus is the ultimate control of testicular sexual function. It has gonadotropic releasing hormone, this GnRH, follicle stimulating hormone, that FSH, which is going to promote spermatogenesis, and it's happening in the seminiferous tubules. It's also producing the LH, luteinizing hormone, which is going to control production of testosterone. And then testosterone is going to be produced by these interstitial cells in the testes. Okay, hormonal control of the ovaries. So female hormonal cascades are very similar to the male in that they're both happening from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and we're releasing very similar hormones, right? There's different mechanisms for them and different triggers, but both of them are highly involved in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So when females go through menopause, ovaries begin to lose their sensitivity to both FSH and LH, and menstrual periods become less frequent, and then finally they stop, right? Eggs and potential follicles are still present, but without that stimulation of FSH and LH, they're not going to be able to produce a viable egg that's released. So the outcome of menopause is that you're not going to be able to have children anymore. Okay, uterine cycle. So again, this is the menstrual cycle, and we are kind of simplifying it. This is something that honestly you could probably spend a whole semester on, but to simplify it, the ovarian cycle, you have the follicular phase, days 1 through 13, where FSH is being produced, follicle maturation is happening, estrogen is being produced, and then within the uterine cycle, menstruation is happening days 1 through 5. The proliferative phase, days 6 through 13. This is when the endometrium is breaking down and then rebuilding during this proliferative phase. And then the secretory phase, days 15 through 28. That's when it's thickening and the glands are secretory as well. So these are kind of happening in tandem. Ovulation day 14 is when you get that luteinizing hormone spike, I should say, LH spike. And then the luteal phase, 15 through 18, that's when that corpus luteum is kind of building up. You're releasing progesterone, and all of this, again, kind of happening in tandem. And the sex hormones that are produced within this ovarian cycle are affecting that endometrium, which is where gestation would occur, and what we're sloughing off during a menstrual cycle. So days 1 through 5, that endometrium is going to disintegrate. Menses is going to pass out the vagina during menstruation or during your actual period. Days 6 through 13, that endometrium is going to thicken. And then ovulation is usually going to occur on that 14th day, right? And then days 15 through 18, the endometrium is going to double in thickness. And then it's just going to go through the whole phase again. So again, female hormone levels are changing quite a bit during the ovarian and uterine cycles. So you can see here the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle phases. So through the follicular phase, and then we have ovulation, and then the luteal phase, menstrual flow happening here, proliferative phase here, secretory phase, and then we can see our hormones that are changing as well. So we have FSH in orange, LH in kind of a red, green down here is progesterone, and then yellow is estradiol, which leads into estrogen, right? So these are our pituitary and our ovarian hormone levels. You can see that they're all spiking near the 14th day of menstruation, which also happens to be your ovulation day. There's FSH and LH are spiking then, estradiol and progesterone. Estradiol is spiking just before that and then dipping down. Progesterone is spiking just after that. So again, this is a pretty complex topic and we won't go into all of it, but ovulation, fertilization, and pregnancy, when your oocyte or your egg bursts from an ovary into the coelom, it's swept into the oviduct by currents in the coelomic fluid, and then fertilization is normally occurring in the oviduct, and then these little things called cilia, which are like hair-like things, are going to move the zygote, which is your fertilized egg, into the uterus, and then it's going to embed into that endometrium, into that uterine lining. Placenta is originating from both maternal and embryonic tissues, and it's going to produce something called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, and it maintains the corpus luteum within the placenta as well, until it begins its own hormone production. So estrogen and progesterone that shut down the anterior pituitary means that there will be no menstruation during this time when gestation is occurring and you're growing the zygote into a fetus and then giving birth. So in humans, the fertilization is occurring soon after the oocyte leaves the ovary. So you can see the ovary here, the fallopian tube here, where it can meet the sperm. And implantation is occurring just 8 or 9 days later here, where we're getting into the uterus and basically implanting into this layer here on the uterine lining called the endometrium. There's rapid fetal growth during the 3rd trimester. So you can see the uterine wall here. We have the fetus in here with the umbilical cord coming from the mom to the baby. and pressing up against the cervix down here. Infertility. So infertility is the inability of a couple to achieve pregnancy. Usually after 1 year of regular unprotected intercourse is when you are officially dubbed potentially infertile, or when you might have to go to a doctor to see maybe what's happening. Usually about 40% of it can be attributed to the male. The female is maybe another 40%. And in the case of both of you, it's usually only about 20%. So it is more common that it's either the male or female, but there is potential that it could be both male and female. Common causes of it: females, endometriosis is a common cause. Males, sometimes it's low sperm count. Um, and there are lots of assisted reproductive technologies like artificial insemination by donor, AID, in vitro fertilization, IVF, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. And keep in mind, these are expensive. All of these are really expensive options. And they're getting, I think, slightly more available. Like, they're becoming more available, more talked about, and slightly cheaper, but they're still obviously way more expensive. It's expensive to have a baby, even if you're doing it naturally. But trying to go this route if you are infertile is extremely difficult. So please keep that in mind. Don't discount how hard people have to work to have a baby. There's also something called gamete intrafallopian transfer, or GIFT, and intracytoplasmic sperm injection, ICSI. These are probably a little bit less common. I feel like we hear about IVF more, or the artificial insemination by a donor as well. But all of these are ways to get around infertility if that is something that is happening with you and your partner. And then embryonic development here. So for the embryo to actually develop, we do need the fertilized egg, right? And that means that a fertile sperm needs to interact with a fertile egg. Remember, sperm can only fertilize an egg, or can only be within the female. Sorry, sperm can actually persist in the female reproductive tract for as much as 3 to 5 days. So that means that they pretty much have to be there either just before or just after / during ovulation, right? And then once that happens and the egg is fertilized, then we're going to go into actually developing the embryo. So this is where these things called blastoceles or blastocysts are actually developing into lots of different cell types, and they're hooked up to the placenta and the amniotic sac, and now we're essentially growing the baby. So after 8 weeks, we consider our embryo to now be a fetus. And again, this is a very simplified version of human reproduction, and we will talk more about development as well in the coming weeks when we start talking about cell differentiation and everything. But a very quick introduction to human female and male anatomy and reproduction. I also realized that my slide for STDs did not make it in here, but there's so many STDs, and we won't really dive into them too much, but some are curable, some are not curable. Some curable STDs are like syphilis, Crabs, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and then you have uncurable ones. So, sorry, incurable would be like herpes, HIV, human papillomavirus or HPV, hepatitis B, lots of different ones, most of which can be prevented by having safe sex. But there are some, like human papillomavirus, HPV. Even if you are having safe sex, sometimes, for any of these, even if you are having safe sex, the potential to get an STD through different routes or methods, whether it's oral sex or actually having sex, or potentially passing it down to your offspring in the case of a mom to their baby while the baby is in the womb. All of these are also possible with certain diseases as well.